All right, welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today we're taking a look back, way back, to explore how our understanding of something so fundamental to being human, our sexuality, first began to take shape.
Yeah, we're talking some seriously foundational, albeit historically situated ideas about, well, sex.
You guys sent in some fascinating excerpts from, who else? Sigmund Freud, from his famous, infamous 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, right?
Right, specifically focusing on the preface from 1920 and the first essay itself.
So we're going deep, really deep into Freud's early thinking on sexual development. And I think we got to admit, it's something everyone talks about, this sex drive. But how many people really, truly understand it?
It's kind of like we throw the term around but don't always stop to think about what's actually driving it, you know? Where does it come from? How does it develop? All those juicy questions.
Exactly. And, Freud himself, right from the start, he really stressed that this whole work, these essays, they came out of his clinical practice, years of working with patients, and his psychoanalytic investigations.
That's key, because this wasn't just some theoretical exercise. He was dealing with real people, real lives, trying to make sense of their struggles, their desires, all within this framework of psychoanalysis that he was developing.
And he very intentionally, very deliberately, kept his I guess you could call it his framework, distinct from purely biological explanations.
He was really trying to carve out a space for a psychological understanding of sexuality, recognizing that it's not just about biology, about hormones and anatomy. There's a whole other layer, a whole psychic world at play.
And judging from all the highlighted sections you guys sent in, I think it's clear you're looking to, well, to move beyond, those really simplistic, almost soundbite level understandings of sex we constantly encounter everywhere we turn.
It's like everyone's got their little script, their little pat explanation, but you guys are digging deeper. You want the nuance, the complexity, the messiness of it all.
Absolutely. So our mission today, if we choose to accept it, is to unpack, to really try to get inside Freud's early thoughts on these things, right?
Yeah, how he saw these sexual instincts unfolding, like starting from infancy, which is mind-blowing to think about, right?
Right. And then his ideas around what he called perversions, which we got to remember that term was used differently back then. It had a different weight, a different medical connotation.
Yeah, and we'll definitely delve into how our understanding of those terms has evolved over time.
And then those links he drew between our sexuality and the development of neuroses, which is, that's where things get really interesting, really start to blur the lines between what we consider normal and abnormal.
We're talking about the intersection of desire, anxiety, and how those forces can shape our personalities, our symptoms, our entire lives.
So we're going to sift through, because let's be honest, some of this is pretty dense and complex stuff, but we're going to try to sift through these ideas and hopefully unearth some surprising, maybe even some insightful takeaways for you guys.
So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride through the history of sex and the mind.
All right, let's start, I guess, with what most people probably think of when they hear sex drive. Right?
Yeah.
That kind of default understanding.
Yeah, like the basic societal narrative. It's kind of like it's not there in childhood, then bam, puberty hits, and suddenly it's all about heterosexual attraction, all for the purpose of, making babies.
Pretty straightforward, pretty neat and tidy, right?
Except Freud, being Freud, right? He starts digging deeper and he starts seeing all these variations, all these things that don't fit that neat little box.
Yeah, his early observations, especially when he looked at what were then considered deviations from the norm.
Yeah.
They really threw a wrench in that whole picture.
It's a big, giant monkey wrench.
He started noticing variations in both, the object of sexual interest, so who someone is attracted to.
Which back then was a seriously radical concept.
Right. And then the aim, so the actual actions, I guess you could say the behaviors, the specifics of what people do in terms of sexual expression.
It's like, you've got this drive, this energy, but then the question becomes, where is it directed? What's the target? And how does it actually manifest?
And to get a little more scientific about it,
Yeah.
to have a term for this underlying sexual impulse, kind of like how we use hunger for that drive to eat, he introduced this concept of libido.
Yeah, libido. It's almost like he needed a word, a tool to talk about this force, this energy that was fueling all these desires, all these variations, something that was constant, even amidst all the differences.
Think of it like the fuel for our sexual desires. Kind of like how hunger pushes us to seek out food. Libido is that internal push, that energy seeking an outlet, a way to be expressed.
And that expression, as Freud observed, could take many different forms, some of which were considered, let's just say not exactly socially acceptable at the time.
All right, so let's dive into what he calls sexual aberrations. And I think we should start with inversion, right?
Sure.
Which today we understand as homosexuality.
That's a great starting point. And it's fascinating to see how, even back then, in Freud's time, the early 1900s, there was this huge debate about, nature versus nurture. Is this something you're born with, or is it something that develops over time?
Yeah, like is it innate or is it acquired? It's a debate that continues to this day in different forms.
And Freud, he lays out both sides of the argument really carefully, presenting the evidence as it was understood back then. So on the acquired side, people were pointing to things like early life experiences, maybe specific childhood events that might shape someone's sexuality.
And external circumstances, right? Like
Yeah.
if you think about war or imprisonment, where people might have only same-sex relationships available to them.
Right. Those situations where, for whatever reason, the opportunity for heterosexual relationships is limited. And then there was even this idea that hypnosis, believe it or not, could somehow influence or even change someone's sexual orientation.
Pretty wild, right?
It shows you how much the thinking was still in flux, how people were trying to grapple with these seemingly new ideas about sexuality.
And then on the flip side, you have the innate perspective, which basically says, some people are just born this way. It's part of their fundamental nature, their constitution.
Like hardwired from the start.
But Freud, he also points out the counter-argument to the acquired view, which is, well, many people go through similar early influences, similar external circumstances, but they don't become, inverted, as they called it back then, or they don't stay that way.
Right. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, you had this experience, therefore you're gay. There's got to be more to it than that.
Exactly. And that's where Freud starts to get really interesting, because he realizes, even back then, that this simple either, this black and white thinking, just doesn't cut it.
He's already recognizing the complexity, the nuance of human sexuality. It's not a simple on-off switch.
So even Freud was already moving beyond that simplistic binary, that kind of reductionist thinking that was so prevalent at the time.
He's laying the groundwork for a much more nuanced understanding of sexuality, recognizing that there are likely multiple factors, both biological and psychological, that contribute to who we are attracted to.
Now, he also touches on some existing ideas from his time, like this idea of psychic hermaphroditism. It sounds kind of like, someone possessing both masculine and feminine psychological traits, but not necessarily in a way that aligns with their physical sex.
Yeah, like having a blend of those inner psychological characteristics, but it doesn't always neatly line up with their outward behavior or their choice of sexual object.
He even mentions that rather simplistic idea of a female brain in a male body, which, let's be honest, is a pretty crude oversimplification.
Right, it's trying to explain something complex with an anatomical answer that just doesn't really fit.
Like, the brain is not that simple. There's not a little switch that says male or female.
It's far more intricate than that. It's a network of interconnected regions and functions, and reducing it to those simple terms just doesn't do it justice.
And he also mentions this theory by Kraft-Ebing about distinct male and female brain centers. But he points out there's really no evidence for that, at least not back then, not in the way that we know about language centers, for example.
So even though there were these attempts to explain sexual orientation from a purely biological perspective, Freud was cautious, he was skeptical, and he wanted to see the evidence before jumping to conclusions.
So I guess the key takeaway here from this early exploration of inversion is that the connection between our sexual instinct, that drive, and the actual object of our desire, who we're attracted to, it might not be as fixed or predetermined as we often assume.
Yeah, he's already starting to challenge those rigid assumptions about how sexuality works, showing us that there's more fluidity, more complexity than meets the eye.
All right, now this next part gets a little sensitive, but I think it's really important to talk about. Freud discusses those instances where children or even animals are chosen as sexual objects.
Yeah, this is definitely uncomfortable territory. But if we're going to understand Freud's work and how his thinking evolved, we need to address it head on, and we need to be sensitive and respectful in how we talk about it.
Absolutely. And again, it's important to remember we're looking at this through the lens of early 20th century thinking, and our understanding of these issues has evolved significantly since then.
But with that caveat in mind, what's striking is how Freud approached this within his theoretical framework. He observed that this kind of object choice often, It often appeared in individuals who, for various reasons, felt inadequate or maybe unable to pursue what they considered to be appropriate, meaning adult objects.
So in a way, he's suggesting that there's a kind of a psychological displacement happening here, right? Where the desire is being directed towards something that's considered taboo or unacceptable.
And what's really fascinating, and I think a little disturbing, is his observation about just how variable, how flexible the sexual object can be compared to something like, basic hunger.
Yeah, like hunger has a very specific demand, right? We need to consume food to survive. But the sexual instinct, as Freud saw it, seems to have a much wider range, much greater latitude in terms of what can be considered a potential object.
It's like the libido, that sexual energy, is always looking for an outlet, a way to be discharged. And if the normal channels are blocked, it can find other more, let's just say, unconventional pathways.
And it can lead to what he describes as a degradation of the object, meaning that things that wouldn't normally be considered sexually stimulating can become so under certain circumstances.
And this is where things get really challenging, because he makes this point, and it's a point that's still relevant today, that these behaviors, these attractions, they're not just limited to individuals who we might label as mentally ill.
Right. And he specifically mentions child sexual abuse and how it can occur in individuals who, in other areas of their lives, seem perfectly normal. And again, that's a really disturbing observation, but it's one that we can't just ignore.
He's challenging that comfortable notion that these are just purely pathological deviations, something that's only found in the realm of mental illness. He's suggesting that there's a continuum, a spectrum, and that under certain circumstances, anyone is capable of these behaviors.
And this leads him to this, this observation that's almost bewilderment at the often surprising normalcy of individuals who have these extreme sexual variations in other areas of their lives.
It's almost like their sexuality is operating on a different track, almost independently from those other aspects of their personality, their morality, their social functioning.
It's as if the sexual impulses, at least in some cases, can act with a degree of autonomy, less consistently controlled by those higher-level cognitive functions we might expect.
Like, logic, reason, morality, those things that we typically associate with being human.
Yeah. It's a pretty unsettling thought. All right, let's move on to what Freud calls anatomical transgressions and overestimation of the sexual object.
Oh, yeah, that sounds a little technical, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. But basically what he's talking about is this idea that, sexual appreciation isn't just about the genitals, right?
Yeah.
It extends to the whole person, to their physical body, even to their personality, their mind, their character.
It's like the sexual instinct, it has this power to imbue the entire object of our desire with this heightened significance, this almost sacred importance.
And this overestimation of the sexual object, as he calls it, can lead to other parts of the body becoming sexual aims in themselves. So it's not just about the genitals anymore. It's about, everything.
Like, the libido can attach itself to specific body parts, specific features, even specific objects associated with the person, and those things can become erotically charged in their own right.
And he uses the example of kissing. Right. And how the mouth, which is, technically a mucous membrane, becomes this site of intense sexual activity, whereas other instances of mucous membrane contact, like, let's not get too graphic here, but you know what I mean, they're considered disgusting.
Right. It's fascinating how culture shapes our perceptions of what's considered sexually acceptable and what's considered repulsive. And Freud, he's always interested in those boundaries, those lines that we draw, and how easily they can be blurred or transgressed.
So he's pointing out the somewhat arbitrary nature of these boundaries and how the libido, that sexual energy, it can actually overcome those feelings of revulsion, those culturally ingrained taboos.
And that's where we get into this really interesting concept of fetishism, right?
Yeah, so how does Freud define that? And what's the transition from this general overestimation we were just talking about to what becomes a pathological fixation, something that's considered, a problem?
It's like, how does something that might be considered a normal part of sexual attraction, finding certain features particularly attractive, turn into something that consumes the entire focus of desire?
So Freud defines fetishism as the substitution of a specific body part, like a foot or a piece of hair, or even an inanimate object that's closely associated with the person, like a piece of clothing, right, for the whole sexual object itself.
It's like, instead of being attracted to the person as a whole, the desire becomes fixated on this one particular detail, this one specific element.
He even uses the analogy of a savage worshiping a fetish like a sacred object.
And the transition to what he considers pathological fetishism, that happens when the focus on this fetish, on this one thing, becomes so fixed, so absolutely necessary for sexual gratification, that it basically replaces the normal sexual aim and becomes the sole object of desire.
So it's no longer about the person, it's about the thing.
And Freud, he's always looking for those early childhood roots, right? So he stresses the importance of early sexual impressions on the development of fetishes. He even mentions that old saying, one always returns to one's first loves.
Which is a pretty powerful image, right?
And he also touches on the idea of symbolic connections, where an object might become a fetish because of an unconscious association, like, the foot as an ancient sexual symbol. So it's not always about the literal object itself, but what it represents, what it symbolizes in the depths of our psyche.
All right, moving on, let's talk about what Freud calls fixations on preliminary sexual aims. So things like touching and looking.
Yeah, those kind of preparatory actions, those steps along the way, that in some cases can become perversions in themselves.
So how does that happen? How do these seemingly normal parts of sexual activity become, well, problematic?
So Freud explains it this way. He says when reaching the normal sexual aim, which, typically means intercourse, when that becomes difficult or maybe inhibited for whatever reason, there's this tendency to become fixated on the steps leading up to it.
It's like getting stuck on the on-ramp, never quite reaching the highway.
Exactly. So, for example, touching, right, in a certain context and to a certain degree, it's perfectly normal. It's part of sexual intimacy.
But when that becomes the primary focus of gratification, when it's no longer a means to an end, but the end itself, then it can be considered a perversion.
It's like the pleasure is being derived from the touching itself, rather than from the ultimate goal of sexual union.
And what about the act of looking? He talks about scopophilia, right?
Yeah, scopophilia, which basically means deriving sexual pleasure from looking. And again, Freud is careful to distinguish between a normal interest in observing, which is perfectly natural, and voyeurism, which is considered a perversion.
So what's the difference? When does looking cross that line?
So, according to Freud, voyeurism becomes a perversion when it's exclusively fixated on genitals, when it involves actively overcoming feelings of disgust, like, watching someone engage in excretory functions, or when the act of looking completely replaces the normal sexual aim altogether.
So it's not just about looking, it's about the context, the intention, and whether it becomes a substitute for, rather than a complement to, other forms of sexual activity.
Exactly. And then he contrasts voyeurism with exhibitionism, where the primary aim is to display one's own genitals to be seen in return.
So it's all about the gaze, about seeing and being seen, but in a way that's considered, well, deviant, outside the bounds of what's socially acceptable.
And he also points out that in both of these perversions, there's this inherent dynamic between activity and passivity. So you have the voyeur and the observed, the exhibitor and the viewer.
It's a power dynamic, in a way, right? One person's looking, the other's being looked at.
And that power dynamic can be very sexually charged, very compelling, which is part of what makes these behaviors so fascinating and so potentially problematic.
All right, let's tackle two more big ones. Sadism and masochism.
Ah, the pleasure and pain duo.
So we're talking about the giving and receiving of pain for sexual pleasure. And again, this is something that, well, it's definitely not for everyone, but it's part of the spectrum of human sexual behavior.
And it's been around for a long time, across cultures, throughout history.
So how does Freud define these terms, and how does he explain them within his theory?
So he defines sadism as the impulse to inflict pain on the sexual object, and masochism as the desire to receive pain.
Pretty straightforward definitions, right?
Yeah, but then he goes deeper, as always, and he notes that there are both active and passive forms of each. So you can have an active sadist who enjoys inflicting pain, or a passive sadist who gets off on the idea of someone else inflicting pain.
And same for masochism, right?
Exactly. An active masochist might seek out pain, might enjoy being dominated, while a passive masochist might simply fantasize about it, might enjoy the idea of being helpless and controlled.
And he also mentions this term, algalania.
Yeah, algalania, which is a little less commonly used, but it specifically refers to the pleasure derived from pain, regardless of whether you're giving it or receiving it.
So it's kind of like the umbrella term for both sadism and masochism.
Exactly. It encompasses both sides of that coin, the pleasure that can be found in both the infliction and the experience of pain.
And he also draws attention to the historical connection between cruelty and the sex instinct, how it shows up in different cultures, different rituals, different forms of erotic expression throughout history.
He even hints at the possibility that it might have some roots in primal aggression, maybe even cannibalistic desires, going way back in our evolutionary history.
But he acknowledges that a full understanding of these perversions, their origins, their mechanisms, it remains somewhat elusive, even for him, even in all his years of research and clinical experience.
There's always more to uncover, more to understand about the depths of human sexuality.
All right, this next question is a big one, and it gets to the heart of how we categorize, how we label these different expressions of sexuality. How do we actually distinguish between what we call a perversion and what we consider a disease?
That's a really crucial question, and it gets to the heart of how society views sexuality, how we define what's normal and what's not.
And again, we have to remember, we're looking at this through a historical lens, and our understanding of these concepts has evolved significantly since Freud's time.
Back then, there was a strong tendency to see perversions as signs of illness, of degeneration, kind of like how homosexuality, or inversion as they called it, was often pathologized, seen as a medical condition rather than a natural variation.
But Freud, he challenges that view, doesn't he?
He does. He really pushes back against that tendency to medicalize everything. And he points out that many of these, let's call them lesser perversions, are actually a part of the healthy sexual lives of a significant number of people.
So it's not as simple as saying this is a perversion, therefore it's a disease.
Exactly. He's highlighting the very real difficulty in drawing a clear line between what's just a normal variation, part of the diverse spectrum of human sexuality, and what actually constitutes a pathology, a genuine mental or emotional disorder.
It's a blurry line, and it raises important questions about, who gets to decide where that line is drawn and what are the social and medical implications of those labels.
Like, who's defining normal? And what are the consequences of being labeled abnormal?
But even Freud, he acknowledges that there are some more extreme perversions, like he mentions coprophilia, which is an attraction to feces, and necrophilia, which is an attraction to corpses. And those are clearly outside the bounds of what most people would consider healthy or acceptable.
Right, and he notes that even in those cases, the individuals who engage in these behaviors often appear otherwise normal in other areas of their lives.
Which reinforces his idea that sexual impulses might operate with a degree of independence from those other psychic functions, those higher-level cognitive processes that we typically associate with our sense of self, our morality, or decision-making.
It's a complex picture, and it challenges some of our basic assumptions about how our minds work, how our desires and impulses are regulated.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the connection between sexuality and neuroses. Freud specifically addresses this in a section called The Sex Drive in Neurotics and Psychoanalysis.
This is where things get really interesting, where we start to see how Freud's ideas about sexuality intersect with his broader theories about the mind and mental illness.
So why bring neuroses into a discussion about sexuality? It might seem like a bit of a jump at first glance.
It might seem that way, but Freud argues that psychoanalysis, that therapeutic method he developed, it provides a really unique, a really crucial lens through which to understand the intersexual lives of people who are suffering from what were then called psychoneuroses, so things like hysteria, obsessional neurosis, those kinds of conditions.
And he makes this pretty bold claim, right? He says that these neuroses are fundamentally rooted in underlying sexual drives, and that the symptoms people experience, those often bizarre, sometimes even debilitating symptoms, are actually a disguised manifestation of their sexual activity.
It's a radical idea, and it really challenged the prevailing medical thinking at the time.
It's like the symptoms are a language, a way for the unconscious to express what's being repressed, what's not being allowed to come to the surface.
And what's really revealing is how he describes the typical characteristics of people who develop hysteria, for example, before the onset of their illness. So he's not just looking at the symptoms, he's looking at the whole person, their personality, their history.
And what does he see? What are those common patterns?
He observes a recurring theme of repressed sexuality, a strong resistance to acknowledging or even engaging with their own sexual instincts, often accompanied by feelings of shame, disgust, maybe a really rigid adherence to morality, and a general avoidance of any intellectual or emotional engagement with sexual matters.
So it's like they're trying so hard to keep those desires, those impulses locked down, pushed out of conscious awareness.
Exactly. And that repression, that internal conflict, it takes a toll. It creates this pressure cooker effect, and eventually something's got to give.
So then how does this repressed sexuality actually manifest as a psychological or even a physical illness?
Freud suggests that When these individuals are confronted with the inevitable pressures of sexual development, puberty hits, hormones are raging, those desires start to bubble up, or maybe they're faced with specific life circumstances that trigger those sexual demands, maybe a romantic relationship, or even just the societal expectations around marriage and procreation.
So the external world starts to press in, forcing them to confront what they've been trying so hard to deny.
Exactly. And that's when the internal conflict becomes too much to bear. The libido, that sexual energy we talked about earlier, it gets transformed, it gets channeled into physical or psychological symptoms as a way of unconsciously avoiding the conscious expression of those forbidden impulses.
So like a detour, a workaround, a way for those desires to find expression without actually having to confront them directly.
And he even goes so far as to suggest that neurosis is, in a sense, the negative of perversion. So instead of those perverse impulses being consciously acted upon, they get diverted from conscious awareness and manifest as these distressing symptoms.
So it's like two sides of the same coin, right? Two different ways of dealing with the same underlying conflict, the same tension between desire and inhibition.
And it really highlights the power of the unconscious, how these forces can shape our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, without us even being aware of it.
All right, let's dive into a couple more key concepts. Partial instincts and erogenous zones.
These are really central to Freud's theory of sexuality, and they help to explain the diversity of human sexual expression, both in what's considered normal and what's labeled as deviant.
So what are these partial instincts exactly? It sounds like a bit of a technical term.
It is, but basically Freud is suggesting that the overall sex drive, that libido we've been talking about, it's not just this single unified force, but rather it's composed of various independent partial instincts.
So it's like a bunch of little tributaries flowing into a larger river, right?
Exactly. And these component drives, these partial instincts, they become really apparent, really visible in the diverse expressions of sexuality that we see, especially in what Freud called perversions.
So he's suggesting that there are these different sources of sexual energy, these different drives that can be directed towards different objects, different aims, different activities.
And he defines an instinct as the psychological representation of an internal somatic stimulus. So in simpler terms, it's like a mental reflection of a physical need or urge.
So it's not just something in our heads, it's rooted in our bodies and our biology.
Exactly. And these instincts, they have certain characteristics. They originate from a specific bodily source, and they have a particular aim, which is to remove that underlying stimulus to achieve satisfaction.
So it's like a pressure builds up, a tension, and the instinct is trying to find a way to release that pressure, to find a way to achieve that sense of satisfaction.
And that's where erogenous zones come in, right?
Yeah, so how do those fit into this whole picture of partial instincts?
So erogenous zones are those specific areas of the body where particular types of stimulation, particular types of touch produce a pleasurable sexual sensation.
So we're talking about like the genitals, the breasts, the mouth, those kind of areas.
Those are the classic examples. But Freud also points out that, in perversions, other areas of the body can become eroticized. They can become sources of sexual pleasure.
So like in someone with a foot fetish, the foot becomes an erogenous zone, even though it's not typically thought of that way.
Exactly. And he observes that in conditions like hysteria, other seemingly non-sexual body parts can actually become erogenous zones, almost like they're mirroring the heightened sensitivity of the genitals during normal sexual arousal.
It's like the libido, that sexual energy. It can get redirected. It can attach itself to different parts of the body, creating new sources of pleasure, new areas of sensitivity.
And he also connects specific senses and body surfaces, like the eye in the act of looking, the skin in experiences of pain or cruelty, and even mucous membranes, to erogenous sensations associated with certain impulses.
So it's really a complex interplay of biology, psychology, and culture, right?
Absolutely. Our bodies, our minds, and our social environment all contribute to shaping our sexual desires and expressions.
Right. Freud then makes this interesting point about this constitutional predisposition to perversions being most clearly seen in children.
Yeah, and this might seem a little counterintuitive at first, right? We tend to think of children as being innocent, pure, not yet corrupted by the world of adult sexuality.
But Freud, he sees it differently, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that it's precisely because children haven't yet fully developed those complex psychological inhibitions, those socialized defenses that come with maturity and internalizing their societal norms, that those more basic, more fundamental component drives of sexuality are more readily observable in their behavior.
So it's like they're closer to those primal instincts, those core desires. They get layered over, get repressed as we get older and more socialized.
Exactly. And he criticizes the historical tendency to overlook the importance of studying infantile sexuality. Like it's somehow taboo or inappropriate to even acknowledge that children have sexual feelings.
But he's saying, no, this is crucial. This is foundational. If we want to understand adult sexuality, we have to understand where it comes from, how it develops.
He's suggesting that the seeds of our adult sexual lives are sown much earlier than we might think, and that these seemingly innocent childhood experiences actually lay the groundwork for who we become sexually as adults.
Which is a pretty radical idea, especially back then.
And he even mentions the phenomenon of infantile amnesia, that general inability we have to remember those very early childhood memories. And he suggests a possible link to those early childhood sexual impulses.
It's almost like we unconsciously repress those memories. We push them down because they're so closely tied to those primal urges, those forbidden desires.
And he draws a parallel to how hysterical amnesia functions, that selective forgetting of traumatic events. It's like our minds are protecting us from those early experiences, those intense feelings that might be too overwhelming for us to handle at that young age.
And he even playfully suggests that it might be more than just a coincidence that infantile amnesia and hysterical amnesia share some similarities, that both seem to serve this protective function, keeping certain experiences out of our conscious awareness.
He's always looking for those deeper connections, those underlying patterns that connect different aspects of our mental lives.
All right, let's move on to another really important phase, the period of sexual latency in childhood.
This is that period, typically between the ages of 5 or so and the onset of puberty, where there's a noticeable decrease in overt sexual activity and interest.
Like things.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.